For millennia, beneath the scorching sands and the crushing silence of the Egyptian desert, there lay a place of absolute darkness. It was a place that no one, no matter how curious or greedy, ever dared to disturb. It wasn't that it was missing from the maps of modern archaeology. Rather, it was protected by a deeply rooted belief that this specific void should remain forever sealed, shielded by a veil of mystery and warnings that have echoed across 3,000 years. Yet, when human persistence finally broke that seal and light pierced through 3 centuries of shadow, what lay before the explorer's eyes was not just a fragment of ancient history. It was something so unexpected it challenged everything we thought we knew about what the pharaohs truly wanted to hide from the world. Ancient Egypt has always been viewed as an open book carved in stone where every monument, every tomb, and every pyramid tells a story of glory, power, and an almost haunting obsession with the afterlife. For centuries, archaeologists, historians, and treasure hunters have relentlessly scoured the Valley of the Kings and the Giza Plateau, fueling the belief that the greatest secrets of this civilization had already been unearthed and cataloged in the world's great museums. But the truth, the one often buried beneath the blinding gold of Tutankhamun, is that Egypt is a land of infinite layers. What we see on the surface today is only a tiny fraction of a reality that is much deeper, much more silent, and at times, far more terrifying. As tourists walk through majestic temples under the beating sun, they rarely realize that just a few feet beneath their boots lie labyrinths, vertical shafts, and chambers that have been completely sealed untouched by oxygen or human sight for dozens of centuries. Among these countless mysteries the desert refuses to yield, there is one chamber in particular that remained absolutely intact for over 3,000 years. It was protected not just by sand, but by an isolation strategy bordering on perfection. Imagine for a moment standing before a massive stone wall, where the last clay seal was placed by hands that ceased to exist millennia ago. Imagine knowing that by crossing that threshold, you are breaking a silence intended to be eternal. Today, we are taking you inside this forbidden place. We will explore every inch of one of modern archaeology's most intriguing discoveries, something that completely shifted how experts perceive what the ancient Egyptians were actually trying to protect from the outside world. Before we venture into the shadows of the past and reveal what was hidden there, if you are fascinated by mysteries that defy time and humanity's relentless search for its origins, pay close attention to every detail of this narrative, because what we are about to reveal is something very few people have ever had the privilege to see up close. The promise of eternal life for the great lords of the Nile didn't just involve the preservation of the body. It required the total isolation of the spiritual essence from any outside interference. For this reason, entering a space sealed with such determination and care isn't just an act of scientific curiosity. It is, in a way, the desecration of an ancestral wish for oblivion and peace. Throughout this video, we will dive into why this specific chamber was kept in absolute secrecy for so long, the nearly invisible signs that led to its discovery, and most importantly, the reaction of the first explorers when they realized that within that dense, ancient atmosphere, they were standing before something that defied all logic. Prepare yourself. The sands of time are about to be blown away once more, revealing a truth hidden for 3 millennia in a place where no one, absolutely no one, was ever meant to set foot. To understand the magnitude of what was found in that silent chamber, we must first dive into the mindset of a civilization that didn't build for the present, but for eternity. Ancient Egypt wasn't just a society of master architects and astronomers. It was a culture driven by a sacred paranoia, an absolute need to hide their treasures, and, more importantly, the bodies of their kings from mortal eyes. In the beginning, the pyramids of Giza served as colossal monuments, screaming the location of the pharaoh's final home to the horizon. But that very grandeur became the enemy of preservation. Those mountains of stone were obvious targets for looters. It didn't take long for the successors of the great builders to realize that for the eternal rest to remain inviolable, ostentation had to give way to invisibility and absolute secrecy. This shift in thinking gave birth to the Valley of the Kings, a barren, remote canyon where the New Kingdom pharaohs decided to hide their tombs within the very bowels of the earth, carving deep corridors into the limestone rock. The goal was to create spiritual fortresses that were impossible to locate, using camouflage techniques that still baffle the imagination. Royal architects didn't just hide entrances under tons of rubble. They designed complex internal structures with corridors that suddenly changed direction, deep vertical pits meant to swallow intruders in the dark, and false walls that appeared to be the end of a gallery but actually hid secret passages to even deeper levels. This engineering of mystery wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Every tomb was a labyrinth of meaning, where the art on the walls served as both a map to the afterlife and a warning to those who did not belong in that sacred space. Imagine the workers who built these chambers. They lived in isolated villages like Deir el-Medina, spending their entire lives sworn to secrecy regarding the exact location of these portals to the underworld. There was an atmosphere of reverence and fear surrounding every stone laid and every clay seal stamped, with the symbol of the jackal, the guardian of the dead. Egypt, therefore, became a vast ocean of sand, beneath which pulsed a second reality, a city of the dead far more complex and protected than the city of the living, flourishing on the banks of the Nile. The complexity of these hidden passages reveals that the Egyptians knew something we moderns often ignore. Time is the greatest treasure hunter of all. They knew that sooner or later, human curiosity or necessity would attempt to desecrate their graves. Because of this, the architecture of concealment evolved to a point where some spaces were not just protected, they were deliberately erased from all official records. While the main tombs were documented in administrative papyri for the priests, certain adjacent chambers or ritual caches were created in absolute secrecy, without any mention in texts or blueprints. These were the ghost spaces, designed to hold what was most sacred or dangerous, far even from the eyes of future royal administrators. Walking through the dark corridors of one of these rediscovered tombs today, the feeling of being watched by walls covered in hieroglyphs is almost palpable. Our modern flashlights reveal pigments that look as if they were applied yesterday, and the silence is so thick you can hear your own heartbeat. It is in this setting of deliberate concealment that the story of our secret chamber begins to take shape. It wasn't just another room in a known royal tomb. It was an apparent geological error that hid a brilliant plan. Egypt was always a master at using nature itself against those who tried to crack its code, and this specific chamber was the pinnacle of that technique. As archaeologists push forward in their research, they often encounter what they call limestone anomalies. Sometimes, what looks like a natural crack caused by time or ancient earthquakes is actually the joint line of a stone door, perfectly fitted and camouflaged with a mixture of dust and resin. This level of dedication to secrecy raises a disturbing question. What could be so important, or perhaps so terrible, that it required an engineering effort greater than the construction of the main tomb itself? Some of these passages were never meant to be opened by human hands again. They served only as vessels for an energy or knowledge intended to remain in eternal symbiosis with the earth. Therefore, when we talk about an Egypt that hid secrets, we aren't just talking about jewelry and gold. We are talking about a philosophy of total isolation. The idea that there are spaces not meant to be found is what makes the discovery of this chamber so electric and, at the same time, so heavy with tension. We are dealing with a will that crossed 30 centuries to tell us that some doors must stay closed. It is precisely when we ignore that silent warning that the true nature of the Egyptian mystery reveals itself, showing us that the desert doesn't just hold the past, it holds questions we may not yet be prepared to answer. But there was one detail, a tiny, almost invisible sign in the texture of a sidewall that would change everything archaeologists thought they knew about that site, proving that not even the deepest silence can hide the truth forever. Modern archaeology is a science of precision, built on detailed maps, ground scans, and a vast library of historical records the Egyptians left behind. Yet, from time to time, the desert decides to play a trick on human logic, revealing something that, according to all official accounts, simply shouldn't exist. This is exactly what happened during a routine excavation aimed only at stabilizing the walls of a well-known tomb. Experts were working in an area that had been mapped dozens of times over the last century, a site considered sterile by veteran researchers who believed every grain of sand in that region had already been sifted. But history, especially in Egypt, has a habit of hiding in plain sight, waiting for the exact moment our guard drops to manifest itself. The mystery began with a technical reading that looked like a calibration error on the ground-penetrating radar. The equipment indicated a significant cavity behind a solid rock wall that, according to architectural plans found in papyri from the time of Ramesses II, should have been the solid foundation of the mountain. Initially, the team dismissed the reading as a natural geological flaw, perhaps an air pocket formed during the crystallization of the limestone millions of years ago. However, there was something about the geometry of that cavity that bothered the trained eye. Nature rarely creates such right angles and symmetrical spaces by pure chance. With a mix of skepticism and a spark of hope, the team decided to perform a small exploratory drill to insert a fiber optic camera. When the first grainy, dusty images appeared on the monitor, the silence at the site was absolute. What should have been raw rock was actually a corridor lined with a thin layer of plaster, preserved in a state of perfection that defied logic. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the existence of the structure itself, it was the fact that there was no visible door from the outside. This chamber hadn't just been closed, it had been integrated into the mountain in such a way that its existence was erased from any physical or textual record. In the archives of ancient Egypt, such as the famous Abbot Papyrus, which details tomb inspections and robbery attempts, there are meticulous descriptions of almost every structure in the valley. But this specific space was a ghost. It wasn't on the offering lists, it didn't appear in the architect's construction logs, and it received no official protection from the priests. This lack of record suggests a fascinating and unsettling possibility, that this chamber was built under a regime of secrecy so strict that not even the palace scribes knew its purpose. In ancient Egypt, if something wasn't written, it technically didn't exist for eternity. The fact that they deliberately omitted this location suggests that whatever was inside belonged to a category of knowledge or ritual that was beyond the jurisdiction of the state and official religion. It was a purposeful glitch in the matrix of Egyptian history, a blind spot created intentionally by architects to hide something that shouldn't be seen, even by the gods of the common pantheon. The sense of fluke or error surrounding the discovery began to give way to a realization that the explorers had stumbled onto something off the charts. Unlike royal tombs, where the entrance is majestic and decorated to guide the pharaoh's soul, everything here pointed toward absolute camouflage. No external hieroglyphs, no signaling stelae, just raw rock, indistinguishable from any other desert cliff. The question echoing in everyone's mind was obvious. Why hide something so drastically if the goal of the Egyptians was to be remembered and honored after death? The short answer is that sometimes secrecy is the only real protection against a danger that isn't physical but spiritual. As the team cleared the debris to understand the extent of the anomaly, it became clear that the chamber had been sealed from the inside out in some spots, or through closing mechanisms that used gravity to position massive stone blocks that no human could move again without destroying the surrounding structure. It was as if the builders had told the universe that this chapter of history was closed and the key had been thrown away. The absence of any historical mention of this place turned the archaeologists not just into scientists, but into intruders in a temporal exclusion zone. The tension at the site mounted by the hour. Working in a place that doesn't officially exist brings a heavy psychological weight. There is always the fear that by opening what was meant to stay shut, we might be disturbing a balance we don't understand. Local workers spoke of a heaviness in the air, a charged atmosphere that seemed to repel human presence. And indeed, when analyzing air samples collected through the small borehole, scientists found that the chemical composition was different from other chambers. The air inside had been stagnant for 3,000 years, creating an isolated microclimate where time seemed to have frozen the exact moment the last worker stepped out and the secret was set. This off-the-books chamber challenges our modern arrogance, the belief that we know all of the past. It reminds us that Egypt is a master of prolonged silence. For every famous tomb we visit, there are perhaps 10 others that remain hidden, not for lack of technology to find them, but because they were designed to be invisible to anyone without the key. The chance discovery, the radar glitch, and the persistence of a detail out of place led humanity to the threshold of a place that simply was never meant to be seen. But if the order was total oblivion, what motivated such a decision? Why, after centuries of tradition where the visibility of a monument was synonymous with immortality, would someone choose absolute isolation and eternal anonymity? The doubt began to take on a darker shape. Was it protection for what was inside, or a desperate warning for those of us on the outside? The question that echoes loudest through the halls of history isn't just how this chamber was found, but how it managed to remain inviolate for over 3,000 years in a land systematically looted since antiquity. To understand this isolation, we must look beyond the depth of the soil and realize that the Egyptians were masters of deterrence, using a lethal combination of physical engineering and psychological terror. While many tombs in the Valley of the Kings had entrances that, though hidden, followed a recognizable architectural pattern, this specific site seemed designed to be repulsive to anyone who approached, whether they were a thief looking for gold or a priest looking for relics. The first factor explaining why no one entered before is the intentional sealing through methods that border on overkill. Unlike common wooden doors or limestone slabs, access to this chamber was blocked by a series of massive granite blocks, one of the hardest stones in the ancient world. These were lowered through a system of counterweights and sand. This mechanism worked like a one-way trap. Once the blocks were released, they fit together with such precision that not even the tip of a knife could be inserted between the joints. For a looter of a later dynasty or a 19th century explorer, breaking this barrier would have required tools they didn't possess and months of loud, grueling work that would have attracted every desert patrol for miles. But the difficulty of access wasn't just a matter of brute force. There was a much more subtle and effective layer of protection: fear. In ancient Egypt, the border between the world of the living and the dead wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a space charged with Heka, the primordial magic that sustained the universe. Local legends, passed down through generations of Bedouins and villagers near the necropolis, spoke of heavy places, areas where time seemed to warp, and where an inexplicable sense of dread prevented even the bravest animals from approaching. This chamber was located in one of these spiritual blind spots, protected by a reputation so dark that for millennia, simply mentioning its location was considered an invitation for misfortune or a premature death. The irony is that religious respect and superstition often served as the most loyal guardians of the Egyptian past. Even during periods of political instability and famine, when grave robbing became a desperate survival industry, certain areas remained untouched. The looters of that era, often the descendants of the very workers who built the tombs, knew the signs. They knew how to tell a common royal tomb from something different, something that didn't belong to the normal cycle of offerings and memory. The absolute silence surrounding this chamber wasn't a silence of forgetfulness, but a silence of respect forced by the unknown. Furthermore, the geographical location was chosen with a wicked cleverness. The entrance was situated in a thermal shadow zone of the mountain, where temperature fluctuations caused constant slides of small stones and dust. This natural erosion acted as dynamic camouflage. With every passing decade, the mountain reclaimed the entrance a little more, burying it under yards of debris that blended perfectly with the natural slope. To anyone looking from afar or even up close, it was just another unstable, dangerous rock face. Nature and man had formed an involuntary alliance to ensure absolute isolation. Another crucial point that kept previous explorers away was the absence of surface clues. Normally, an important tomb leaves a trail, fragments of ritual pottery, remains of ventilation shafts, or tool marks on the surrounding rocks. In the case of this chamber, the post-construction cleanup was performed with obsessive rigor. Records suggest that every stone chip removed was hauled miles away, and the terrain was leveled to look as if it had never been touched. It was a millennia-old crime scene cleanup. The goal wasn't just to hide the door, but to erase the fact that there had ever been a door there at all. This leads us to a doubt that began to trouble modern archaeologists as they analyzed the defensive structure. Why so much effort? In the Egyptian world, extreme security was usually tied to protecting immeasurable treasures, like those of Tutankhamun. However, the sealing style of this chamber was different. It didn't look like an attempt to protect something valuable from the outside world, but rather a desperate attempt to keep something contained. The problem is that while analyzing the marks on the granite blocks, archaeologists noticed something that froze them in their tracks. The direction of the seals and the tilt of the closing stones suggested that the builder's greatest concern was what would happen if communication between the inside and the outside were ever restored. Was it protection for the purity of the soul dwelling within? Or was it a silent warning, a spiritual quarantine that lasted 3,000 years to protect the living from a secret that should never have been awakened? The difference between a fortress and a prison is often just a matter of perspective. At that moment, facing that impregnable barrier, the team began to wonder if the fact that no one had entered before was a stroke of luck they were about to throw away. The air around the excavation seemed to drop several degrees when the drill finally pierced the last layer of granite, revealing that behind all that engineering of fear lay a void pulsing with an energy no one was prepared to face. But there was one even more intriguing detail. Next to the sealed entrance, nearly invisible under direct light, was a single inscription that wasn't a name or a prayer, but a direct instruction that would completely change what we know about this place. Reaching the threshold of a discovery hidden for 3,000 years isn't a loud, cinematic event. It is a process weighed down by an oppressive silence, where every second stretches and the responsibility on the researchers' shoulders becomes almost unbearable. When the team finally stood before the last stone barrier, the mood at the site had completely shifted. Gone was the constant chatter of assistants or the distant hum of equipment. There was only the heavy breathing of people who knew they were about to violate a perfect time capsule, a space sealed with the explicit intent of never being revisited. The peak tension was fueled by fear of the unknown, but also by a near religious respect emanating from the depths of the Egyptian earth, as if the mountain itself were watching to see what human curiosity would dare do next. The entry was slow, meticulous, and desperately cautious. Any mistake at this stage wouldn't just destroy valuable evidence, it could compromise the safety of everyone present. As hydraulic jacks and diamond-tip drills did their silent work, removing the last inches of rock, a tiny crack began to form. And it was at that moment that something happened, which none of the scientists there will ever forget: the sound of the air. It wasn't just any noise. It was a high-pitched hiss, like a long, deep sigh, as 21st century atmospheric pressure finally met the stagnant air of 1100 BC. It was the sound of two different timelines colliding. For a few moments, no one moved, as if that sigh were a final warning to back away before the light profaned what the darkness had guarded so well. The sensory description of that moment is what separates a common discovery from a transcendent experience. The smell wafting from the crack wasn't one of decay, as many might imagine. It was a dry, metallic, slightly sweet aroma, a mix of millennial dust, cedar resins, and time itself that seemed to have solidified in that enclosed space. Light entered for the first time in millennia, not as a flash, but as a single, trembling beam from a high-powered flashlight cutting through the haze of suspended dust. At first, there was nothing but dancing shadows that seemed to come alive on the walls, but as the explorers' pupils adjusted and the light swept the space, the first vision began to materialize. What appeared before them wasn't the blinding glint of gold, but something much more impactful: the absolute preservation of a frozen moment. The problem was that, unlike royal tombs, which usually have antechambers filled with chariots, weapons, and guardian statues, this chamber presented an aesthetic of austerity that was, in itself, terrifying. The walls weren't covered with the vibrant colors we usually see in documentaries. They were a dense, heavy gray, where the plaster seemed to have absorbed the very essence of the silence. In the center of the room, The light revealed something unexpected that made the lead archaeologist's heart skip. Footprints. Human footprints, perfectly sharp in the thin layer of dust covering the floor. They were the marks left by the last men to walk out of there 3,000 years ago, preserved so perfectly it looked as if they had just turned the corner. That sight humanized the secret, turning a historical site into a scene that still vibrated with the presence of those who sealed it. But the detail that truly changed the team's perception was how the light reacted to what was at the back of the chamber. As the flashlight scanned the corners, it revealed that the ceiling wasn't flat, but carved to mimic the night sky with thousands of tiny stars that seemed to pulse under the artificial light. However, these weren't ordinary stars. Looking closer, they realized that each one was aligned with an astronomical precision that didn't match the official knowledge of that specific dynasty. It was as if the chamber weren't just a storehouse for relics, but an underground observatory, a star map meant to be read in eternal darkness. The feeling was that we hadn't entered a tomb, but a time machine whose function was still a complete mystery. The tension, which should have eased with a successful entry, only intensified. There was something in the atmosphere of that chamber that defied the presence of oxygen. The light seemed to be eaten by the walls in certain spots, creating zones of shadow that refused to vanish even under the power of LED floodlights. It was then that one of the technicians noticed the temperature inside was dropping rapidly, a physical anomaly that shouldn't occur in such a deep, isolated rock cavity. It was as if the opening of the chamber were draining heat from the outside world, or as if something inside were reacting to the intrusion. The silence, which before was just the absence of sound, now seemed to have a texture, a weight pressing against the ears, generating a dizziness that forced many to take a step back. And it was exactly in that moment of collective hesitation that the main flashlight beam landed on the central object of the chamber. It wasn't a golden sarcophagus. It wasn't a monumental statue of a pharaoh. What stood there, at the heart of the mystery, was something no historical record had predicted, and that challenged every archaeological theory built over decades. The light revealed a smooth, black surface, a material that seemed to absorb all light radiation, becoming a physical absence in the middle of the room. Around this object, arranged in a perfect circle, were small alabaster jars containing substances that, even after 3,000 years, still emitted a faint bluish luminescence when hit by the reflection of the light. The discovery was shifting scales. It was no longer just about the past, but about something that seemed disconnected from the human timeline. That sensory vision, mixing the freezing temperature, the bluish glow, and the absolute silence, created a moment of simultaneous epiphany and terror. The archaeologists realized the reason no one had entered before wasn't just because of the granite blocks or the written curses. It was because what was inside operated on a logic the outside world wasn't yet ready to understand. And this reveals something unexpected, something hidden just behind that black object that would completely change the meaning of the entire expedition. But before they could step closer to investigate, one of the motion sensors installed at the entrance began to trigger frantically, even though absolutely nothing was moving in the corridor. The revelation of what was kept in that chamber didn't happen suddenly, like a veil being pulled back all at once. It came in successive layers of strangeness that challenged the sanity and logic of the research team. After the initial shock of the opening and the stabilization of the internal atmosphere, archaeologists began cataloging the items. It was then they realized the organization of this space didn't follow any known funerary canons of ancient Egypt. Where there should have been canopic jars containing the organs of a pharaoh, there was something far more enigmatic. Where there should have been servant statues for the afterlife, there was only a void. The first layer of discovery revealed that the small alabaster containers arranged in a circle didn't contain decomposed organic remains, but a crystalline substance of a purity nearly impossible for the technology of the time, one that reacted vibrantly to artificial light. As the team approached the center of the room, the black object that had looked like a mass of shadow began to reveal its true face under the direct focus of the spotlights. It wasn't a sarcophagus. It was a monolithic structure composed of a type of mineral that the geologists present couldn't immediately identify. The surface was so polished it didn't reflect light, it seemed to swallow it, creating the illusion of a three-dimensional hole in the middle of the chamber. But what truly paralyzed the researchers was the discovery that, engraved with microscopic precision on this black surface, weren't traditional hieroglyphs praising the gods, but complex geometric schemes and representations of constellations. These maps showed the sky not as it was in the time of Ramesses, but as it would have been seen thousands of years before the founding of the first Egyptian dynasty. The problem was that the sophistication of that piece was so far out of historical context that it felt like standing before a physical anachronism. It was something that simply shouldn't be there. But the surprises didn't stop at the monolith. Behind it, in a niche carved directly into the living rock wall, the light revealed the second layer of the discovery, a series of extremely thin metal sheets, almost like paper, stacked and protected by a box of volcanic glass. When the first archaeologist touched one of these sheets, he noticed it showed no signs of corrosion or patina, despite 3 millennia of isolation. The metal emitted a crystalline sound when moved, and its surface was covered in microscopic writing, a code that mixed known phonetic signs with symbols reminiscent of circuits or flow maps. At this point, the entire perception of the place shifted radically. The chamber wasn't a tomb for a body, it was a preservation capsule for specific information. There was no corpse, which was the ultimate heresy in Egyptian culture unless the dead they were trying to preserve was actually an idea or knowledge they considered too dangerous to circulate among the living. Experts began to notice that the arrangement of every item in the room created a kind of full-scale diagram. The alabaster jars with the luminescent substance were positioned at points that corresponded exactly to geographical landmarks in Egypt, as if the chamber were a miniature, energetic representation of the kingdom itself, with the central monolith serving as the axis connecting the earth and the cosmos. The third layer of the revelation emerged when the team decided to examine the floor beneath the black monolith. Using an ultrasonic scanner, they discovered the object wasn't just resting on the ground, it was connected to a network of thin conduits that reached even deeper into the mountain, going far beyond where any human excavation had ever dared. This completely changes what we know about the utility of these sealed chambers. They weren't final destinations, they were interface points. In one corner of the room, a single human object was found, a solitary leather sandal, abandoned in a hurry near the exit. This tiny domestic detail, amidst all that isolation technology and astronomical mystery, raised a haunting question. Why did someone leave such a sacred and immutable place in such a frantic rush? As the hours passed, the team noticed the bluish substance in the jars was beginning to change color, growing more intense as the room temperature rose due to human presence. It was a warning that by entering, we had activated a process that had been in hibernation for millennia. It wasn't just a dead chamber, it had a latent life, a programming waiting for the return of light to continue its function. The weight of this realization began to hang over the archaeologists like a thick cloud. They hadn't just found relics, they had found a mechanism. A mechanism the ancient Egyptians feared so much that they decided to bury it under tons of granite and erase it from every official history book. Nothing there was direct or obvious. Every detail led to a new doubt. Why use a mineral that doesn't exist in abundance on Earth to create a hidden monument? Why record prehistoric constellations in a new kingdom tomb? And most importantly, why did the Egyptians, known for their obsession with the immortality of their names, leave this place without a single royal signature? It was as if the chamber were a legacy from an even older civilization, one the Egyptians found and decided their only mission was to protect and hide from the rest of humanity. The realization that we weren't just looking at the past, but at something that crossed eras, transformed the excitement of discovery into a feeling of deep humility and a touch of dread. It wasn't just a chamber, it was something that shouldn't be there, because it challenged the chronology we built for our own species. The black monolith, the metal sheets with unknown codes, and the conduits lost in the depths of the earth suggested that the Egypt we know, with its pharaohs and pyramids, was merely the guardian of a much older and deeper secret. And when the light hit a specific angle on the back wall, it revealed the final piece of the puzzle. A painting that didn't show gods with animal heads, but human figures looking up, watching something descending from the heavens toward the exact spot where the chamber was built. That wasn't a tomb, it was a landing mark, or perhaps a point of departure. Trying to decode the meaning of a discovery that shatters the standards of traditional archaeology is like trying to assemble a puzzle whose pieces seem to belong to different worlds. What do this chamber and its contents truly represent for our understanding of ancient Egypt? For decades, we were taught that the pharaohs built to celebrate their own divinity and ensure safe passage to the field of reeds. But the existence of this place suggests there was a parallel agenda, one much deeper and more secret, running silently beneath the official religion we know. Perhaps the meaning of it all is that Egypt wasn't just a civilization of tomb builders, but rather the guardians of a legacy they themselves considered too ancient, or perhaps too dangerous, to be shared with the masses or recorded on public monuments. One of the most fascinating interpretations emerging among researchers is that this chamber functioned as a sort of seed vault for human knowledge. However, instead of biological seeds, what was being preserved was the essence of a science we would today call anachronistic. The problem is that when we look at the metal sheets and the black monolith, we realize the language used wasn't meant for the pharaoh's contemporaries. It was meant for someone with a technical understanding that humanity would take another 3,000 years to rediscover. This completely changes our view of Egyptian isolation. They weren't just hiding treasure from thieves, they were protecting a technological or spiritual heritage from a future they foresaw as one of forgetfulness and darkness. Many historians are now beginning to wonder if the priestly elite of Egypt, especially the high initiates of the House of Life, were the direct heirs of an even older tradition, the legendary Zep Tepi, or the first time. According to Egyptian myths, there was an era when the gods walked the earth and taught men the arts, astronomy, and medicine. If we accept, for a moment, the idea that these gods were actually survivors of a highly advanced previous civilization, the meaning of this secret chamber becomes crystal clear. It is a missing link. It is physical proof that the Egyptians knew they were the last steps of a ladder descending from a glorious, unknown past. The monolith and the prehistoric star maps would, therefore, be reminders of an origin that official history tried to erase, but the desert insisted on preserving. But there was a detail archaeologists noticed shortly after something that complicates any purely materialistic interpretation. The arrangement of the objects and the bluish luminescence of that unknown substance suggest the chamber had an active function, not just a passive one. It wasn't a museum. It was a transmission or anchoring station. Some theorists suggest Egypt functioned as a network of energy points, where chambers like this served to stabilize the knowledge or consciousness of that civilization against the chaos of time. Perhaps this explains something that has always been hidden, why Egyptian art and culture remained almost unchanged for 3 millennia. Maybe they weren't stagnant, but operating under a directive coming from these secret places, maintaining an order we can barely conceive of today. Another viewpoint, a darker one, focuses on the warning. If the builders went to such lengths to seal the site and use materials not native to the region, perhaps the meaning is a quarantine. In the ancient world, knowledge wasn't just power. It was something that could destroy those who weren't prepared for it. Opening this chamber might mean we've broken a safety barrier placed there for our own good. The meaning of the absence of bodies or names might be that what is inside belongs to no one, or rather, it belongs to a force that has no human identity. We are dealing with an architecture of containment, and what was found might be the trigger for something we don't yet fully understand. Furthermore, the connection to the Egypt we see on the surface becomes almost superficial in light of this new reality. We begin to realize the great temples of Karnak or the pyramids of Giza might just be the book cover, while the true content is written in these chambers no one was ever supposed to enter. Current scientific interpretation tries to fit these discoveries into known molds, calling the metal sheets ritual objects and the monolith a ceremonial stone. But these are just labels that hide our own ignorance. The true meaning is a direct challenge to our chronology. It forces us to admit that the past is much more complex, technological, and mysterious than our schoolbooks allow. This chamber shows us that the ancient Egyptians were, above all, masters of temporality. They understood that history moves in cycles and that eventually everything they built would be covered by sand and forgotten. However, by creating these off-the-record spaces, they ensured that the core of their wisdom, or perhaps the proof of their stellar origin, would survive the empires that came after. The meaning of this is that we are only the latest guests at a party that started much longer ago than we imagine. And by crossing the threshold of this chamber, we aren't just discovering Egypt, we are rediscovering our own position in the universe. Perhaps what was found there isn't an answer, but a mirror. A mirror reflecting how primitive we still are in our search for answers, fumbling in the dark while past civilizations already mastered concepts of energy and astronomy we are only beginning to scratch. The meaning of it all, in the end, might be a reminder of humility. Egypt tells us there is truly nothing new under the sun, and that the secrets we try to unravel today were once the daily routine of those who walked these sands before us. And it is in the deafening silence of the chamber that the truth begins to whisper, something we aren't yet ready to fully accept, but something that will forever change how we look at the stars and the depths of the earth. The discovery of this chamber, with its logic-defying secrets and technology from another time, places us before an overwhelming and fascinating reality. If a place of such importance and complexity managed to stay hidden for over 3,000 years in one of the most explored regions on Earth, what else still rests beneath the silent shroud of the Egyptian sands? The truth is that for every square mile archaeologists map, hundreds of others remain untouched, protected by dunes that move like waves and a geology that seems to conspire to keep the past in its place. Modern archaeology, despite all its ground-penetrating radar and infrared satellite imagery, has barely scratched the surface of what this civilization truly built within the earth. If we look at the map of Egypt with a critical eye, we see that the vast majority of our discoveries are concentrated in a narrow strip along the Nile. But the Western Desert and the high plateaus hide anomalies that official science hasn't had the resources or the courage to investigate deeply. There are reports of entire cities buried under the sand, structures that don't appear in history books and are mentioned only in Bedouin legends as places where time does not pass. Finding a chamber sealed for 3 millennia is a reminder that Egypt is a living organism, an entity that decides when and to whom it will reveal its secrets. The fact that we access this specific site might just be the first domino to fall, revealing a subterranean network of knowledge connecting all the great monuments of antiquity. What hasn't been discovered yet could be much more than gold or sarcophagi. We could be talking about entire libraries engraved on indestructible materials, or mechanisms that, like the black monoliths, serve purposes our current science can't even categorize. Recent projects like scan pyramids have already detected massive voids and inexplicable cavities inside the Great Pyramid of Giza spaces, with no visible entrances that defy conventional structural explanations. If there are monumental voids inside the pyramids, how many chambers like the one we explored today are scattered across the Valley of the Kings or beneath the paws of the Sphinx? The possibility that Egypt possesses a subterranean mirror city designed to survive cataclysms and time itself is a theory gaining ground with every discovery like this. The problem is that our search for the unknown is often limited by our own preconceptions of what the past should be. We look for traces of a primitive society, but what Egypt insists on showing us is the trail of a wisdom that seems to have begun at its peak. This chamber no one was meant to enter is the final loop of this journey, because it takes us back to square one of our curiosity. If what we found is so advanced and mysterious, what remains in the deeper layers those the radar can't reach, and human fear hasn't yet allowed us to explore? Egypt isn't a finished history lesson. It's a constantly expanding enigma where every answer opens 10 new questions that force us to look back with a mix of reverence and awe. How many other chambers have stayed hidden for 3,000 years? And how many more will stay that way for 3,000 more? Perhaps the preservation of these secrets is necessary for our own survival as a species. Or perhaps we are being prepared, drop by drop, for a revelation that will change the course of humanity. What has yet to be discovered is out there, pulsing in the silence of the desert, waiting for the moment our technology and our consciousness are ready to handle the truth. Until then, we will keep walking over the sands, knowing that just beneath our feet lies a universe of mysteries that time, in its infinite wisdom, has decided it isn't yet time to fully surrender. As we reach the end of this journey into the chamber where no one was meant to enter, it's clear that ancient Egypt isn't just a yellowed page in a history book. It isn't just a tourist destination of grand monuments. It is, in essence, a living enigma that continues to whisper secrets through the centuries, challenging our understanding of time, technology, and the very nature of life and death. What we've seen today, the silence broken after 3,000 years, the stagnant air of millennia, the black monolith, and the inscriptions that defy our timeline, is just a glimpse of a much vaster reality still resting beneath the Egyptian soil. That chamber wasn't built for us. And perhaps the fact that we managed to penetrate its secret is a sign that the times are changing and that the truths carefully guarded by the pharaohs and their priests are finally ready to emerge. Diving into these depths teaches us that humanity has a natural tendency to underestimate those who came before us. We look at the past with modern condescension, believing we are the pinnacle of intelligence. But places like this force us to admit we may have lost more than we gained along the way. The feeling of being in a place where light hadn't entered since before the founding of modern empires is a transformative experience. It reminds us that we are only temporary passengers on a planet that holds scars and secrets of eras we can barely imagine. Egypt is the guardian of those memories, an archive of stone and sand that refuses to be fully decoded, always keeping one last door locked to remind us of our own smallness in the face of eternity. If you followed this narrative this far, you likely feel the same electricity and curiosity that drove explorers to break that granite seal. Mystery draws us in because it connects us with something larger, with the relentless search to understand who we were and where we are going. The question that remains, hanging in the air like the golden dust of the Valley of the Kings, is something you must answer for yourself. Knowing everything that was found, knowing the weight of the silence and the warnings that crossed millennia, would you have the courage to take the next step? Would you have the courage to enter a place, knowing that perhaps the knowledge within would forever change how you see the world and your own existence? Egypt will remain there, under the relentless sun and the stars it studied so deeply, guarding what we are not yet ready to see. And we will remain here, watching every new excavation, every new signal caught by radar, waiting for the next sigh of ancient air to tell us one more chapter of this endless story. After all, the search for truth is what makes us human. And as long as there is a sealed door and a secret buried in the sands, there will be someone willing to challenge the forbidden to bring light to what was destined for the shadows. If this kind of mystery grabs your attention and makes you question everything we know about our past, don't let that flame go out. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next explorations, because what we reveal today is only the beginning of a series of discoveries that promise to shake the foundations of traditional archaeology. Leave a like if you felt the tension of entering that chamber with us, and most importantly, comment below where you're watching from and what you believe the Egyptians were truly trying to hide. Your theory could be the key to the next mystery we solve together. Until the next journey, where the past and the present meet once more.